Well, hi everyone. A number of you have reached out to me asking if I had an update on the Millennium Tower saga in San Francisco. I've done a number of videos about this building. I've got a playlist link in the description if you want to check it out. This is probably going to be the last update, barring anything unexpected like a major earthquake to strike San Francisco area in the coming years. And I'll tell you exactly why I think there's going to be essentially no new news on this building. It's going to be by design. But there is some updates here that we can cover based on the published monitoring reports for the instrumentation data that's been collected and posted to the City of San Francisco's building department website. So I'm going to go over that. But this is going to be a wrap-up video because it's really important, I think, to get to the root of why this saga is so compelling for so many people. I mean, there are multiple storylines here, aside from the technical matters of interest. So as many of you know, there was a so-called repair effort that was initiated in 2021, and it caused more problems initially than it was intended to solve in terms of foundation settlement and building tilt. But ultimately, they scaled back their program from 52 perimeter piling to 18 perimeter pile on the north and west sides of the building. Unlike the main pile foundation for the building that didn't extend to bedrock, these perimeter pile were installed to approximate depths of 250 feet to key into bedrock. The main building piles only extended about 80 feet into a dense sand layer. And below that sand layer was a layer of marine clay that was subject to consolidation settlement due to the stresses imposed by the overlying building foundation. Now, this is a plot from one of these monitoring reports. This is from 2025 that shows the location of these surface settlement points as well as the magnitude of settlement since they started monitoring. And it just shows you in 2026, a year later, very little change in the amount of settlement. And we can see the location of these vaults on the north and west side of the building that contain these perimeter pile that extend to bedrock that are attached to the 10-foot mat foundation that covers the roughly 1,000 concrete pile that extend to a depth of about 80 feet into a dense sand layer. And here we see the plots of the individual settlement points going back to when they started the repair work, so-called repair work, in 2021. And you could see here that as they undertook this repair work, this so-called repair work, they actually accelerated the rate of building foundation settlement because they had removed a lot of soil, and that was not intended as part of the design. The designers and the building representatives blamed the contractor. I don't think that was reasonable, but they all managed to scale back the scope of the remediation from 52 pile to 18 pile, as I mentioned, and decided not to sue each other. They just worked their way through it. But you can see up to the current time here, the rate of settlement has declined. It's essentially flatlined. But we go to the historical plot. The building was constructed from 2005 to 2009, and apparently news of the foundation settlement, which exceeded the original calculated amount in the original geotechnical report for this building foundation, wasn't made public until 2016. And of course, that initiated several lawsuits, which ultimately caused a big decline in the resale value of these units, these 435 units in this building. So a remediation program of these perimeter piling was initiated in 2021. They inadvertently caused increased rates of building foundation settlement and tilt until they scaled back the scope of the remediation program. But what I want to point out here is if you look at the slope of the settlement curves prior to them starting this 2021 work, the rates of settlement had slowed considerably, such that primary settlement was largely completed. And you can think of primary settlement as it's a phenomenon with clay soils, saturated clay soils, and it's a situation where you increase the effective stress and you drive off excess pore water pressure It's much like the idea of squeezing a saturated sponge and you expel the water. And as you do that, the sponge compresses. That's primary settlement, if you want to think of it that way. They originally calculated about 6 inches of total building foundation settlement. And of course, by the time they undertook this repair work, they had well in excess of, on average, 15, 16 inches of settlement. Settlement amounts were still increasing slightly because of a phenomenon called secondary consolidation. And if we think about the sponge analogy, let's say you've expelled all the water that you can and you continue to apply stress and you start to compress the actual fibers of the sponge. You basically compress the actual individual components of the soil structure. That can continue for many, many years, and that's called secondary consolidation. And in some cases, the secondary consolidation can amount to quite a bit of settlement. Although, again, the rates here were rather flat. And I think just looking at the plots, they would have been better off relative to undertaking this remediation effort to not have done anything. Although there was an alternative remediation option that they could have undertaken, and that consisted of installing micropiles through the 10-foot thick mat foundation in between the existing piling and extending those micropile to bedrock. And there are many engineers, particularly local engineers, very experienced structural and geotechnical engineers, that thought that was a superior repair option, but at the time was considered to be a little more expensive than what they did with this $100 million perimeter piling upgrade, which originally was supposed to be $100 million for the 52 pile and ended up being a little over $100 million for 18 pile, such that their $6.8 million extra costs relative to what they had obtained through their various lawsuits for the work was made up by a special assessment by the homeowners association. So these unit owners had to cough up tens of thousands of extra dollars to provide the coverage for the cost overrun. And in a similar fashion, this is a plot of the building tilt. See a lot of tilt occurring to where today it's around 27 inches. The max was around 29. So through this perimeter piling upgrade, or whatever you want to call it, so-called fix is what I call it, in my opinion, they only recovered about 2 inches of the building tilt, far less than what their goal had been, according to statements made by the lead designer. In this case was an engineer named Ron Hamburger, a structural engineer who worked for the firm Simpson, Gumpertz, and Hager. I understand he's since retired. In fact, the Millennium Tower was apparently his last engineering project in his career prior to retiring. But he made a number of statements. He went on a promotional tour before, during, and after this printer pile upgrade, as they called it, was implemented, and quite cynical in my view. He made statements that the repair effort really wasn't necessary. It was a voluntary upgrade, and it was being done solely to recover the real estate values for these units in the Millennium Tower building. You know, engineers have an ethical requirement in the practice of their profession. And unfortunately, there's not the equivalent of a Hippocratic oath that doctors have, although I've run into doctors that I thought were real quacks. So I don't know that the Hippocratic oath is uh, helpful as it should be. But at any rate, the idea is to first do no harm. And I think it's just interesting that the philosophy, apparently, given the statements of Ron Hamburger for this remediation of the building foundation, was to recover real estate values. To me, that's should be left to the realm of the marketers and the real estate promoters and developers, and shouldn't be within the purview of engineering. But that's my opinion. But if you look at the whole building saga, from the original design all through today, from a geotechnical engineering standpoint, to me, it's analogous to the hold my beer moment. It's, to me, a big embarrassment to the profession, things that you wouldn't expect would happen in modern engineering, but yet apparently does. But since this is in San Francisco, maybe it should be a hold my Chardonnay moment. But if we go back to these periodic monitoring reports that are posted on the City of San Francisco Building Department website, we can see they have various objectives for monitoring the building foundation, and they have certain red flags that so far haven't been observed. But one of their criteria for an alert has to do with the load on these 18 perimeter pile, because once they installed them to bedrock and attached them to the building foundation, they applied a jacking load to load up the piling, to distribute load from the mat and the relatively shallow pile supported mat to these 18 perimeter piling. And one of their action levels is if you total up the load on those 18 pile, it needs to be above 16,200 kips. A kip is 1,000 pounds. So over 16,200,000 pounds. And we can see that the total load has flirted with that limit line. And I have no doubt at some point it's going to drop below that threshold. But it's my prediction that they will do absolutely nothing about it. Because again, these are monitoring reports. They're not including any engineering evaluation or opinions in these monitoring reports. And because the whole stated goal for this repair plan, the so-called repair plan, was to recover real estate values, the last thing anybody wants is another round of work on this foundation. It would just generate a lot of additional negative press, in my view. Sensibly, the action would be to reapply the loading to these pile. But again, I don't think that's going to happen because you have to get to these pile through these sidewalk vaults. And again, that would be really disruptive. It would call attention to the situation with this building, which nobody wants. I mean, the situation with this building has largely been out of the news for the last year and a half since they completed, actually 2 years plus since they completed the remediation work. And the only stories really have been the lack of recovery of the property values for this building. For example, there was a Wall Street Journal article last year. The headline was Millennium Tower stopped sinking, but apartment values did not. And then there was this article in The Real Deal, and I have links to these various sources in the description of this video. This is from last June, and they've got this Dr. Joel Pizer, who's the president of the Millennium Tower Homeowners Association Board, and they blame the negative press for the lack of recovery in their property values. And this article quoted Dr. Pizer as saying, "We've gotten so much negative press, we are easy targets. A bunch of people who have been successful in life and then are faced with this challenge," Pizer told the Journal. "Now we have something to counter it with. We have met the project's objectives to stop the building from settling, and we're recovering." I don't begrudge anybody their wealth, however they came about it, whether they inherited it or they worked hard. But this kind of quote has the vibe of "don't hate me because I'm beautiful." And this article goes on to quote a representative of Millennium Tower who disputed the characterization that the building values haven't recovered because of the building's history. And they basically said, hey, condo values have fallen throughout the area of San Francisco here, which was true for a short period of time. But the decrease in values for Millennium Tower were far greater than the overall market decline that occurred at the time. In my research, a lot of these units have sold for about half of what they were originally sold for. And I think one of the reasons why people are drawn to this story is certainly not everybody, but a few people, I think, who moved into this building did it to more or less show off. And I got a lesson in showing off when I was a kid. Back in the 70s, Evel Knievel was popular, and kids would convert their bicycle with the swept handlebars to something more of a motocross style, and you would ride over ramps and stuff like that. And I set up some ramps and showed my mom this jump that I did, and I completely wiped out and hit my head. And of course, we weren't wearing helmets back then, and pretty well rang my bell. And I walked up to my mom, and she goes, "That's what you get for showing off," which was pretty hardcore, but point well taken. And this CBS segment on the Millennium Tower sets the stage pretty well of what many people were trying to achieve from a status perspective by moving into this building in the first place.
645 feet of reinforced concrete wrapped in glass. Inside the $550 million construction, as advertised, lavish condominiums flush with amenities, attracting tech barons and venture capitalists.
Well, we've got a new wave of tech barons moving into San Francisco with the AI boom. And unfortunately, according to my research, the Millennium Tower units have not seen a commensurate rebound in values. Their units are going for around $1,000 a square foot, which is a lot for most places in the country, whereas other highly desired developments in the city of San Francisco are going for around $2,000 a square foot. So the property values, unfortunately for the owners of Millennium Tower, just have not recovered following this so-called fix, this voluntary perimeter piling upgrade. And I think they know that the building just has too much negative history. And again, it's unfortunate. I don't understand how the developer was able to not disclose the material aspects of the building settlement prior to selling these units. And, it's outside my scope of this channel or my professional expertise to weigh into any legal matters. I'd be interested to know what you all think out there, but I think it has to do with just the fact that the pockets apparently weren't deep enough to make everyone whole from a developer standpoint after they bought these units and then found out the issues with the building settlement. And the most recent video I had done about the Millennium Tower in my series of updates was last January 2025, following a nasty gram that I got from a person who said that they were representing the Millennium Tower Homeowners Association, a PR firm, and threatened me that essentially I should take down my videos and not do more because they thought their building was fixed and people shouldn't talk about it anymore, which is ridiculous. And so the video I did about that letter I received from the PR firm generated about 70,000 views. So it's kind of interesting that apparently at the time, the Homeowners Association engaged a PR firm that appears to have not been familiar with the Streisand effect. So I don't know where they go from here. I think their strategy is just to simply keep this building out of the news. I think they'll be loath to assess any more special assessments on the unit owners. I think for good reason. That would generate a lot more negative press. I think they should have considered alternatives to the limited perimeter piling upgrade, as they call it, that cost over $100 million. I think an argument could have been made to do nothing for a while if they weren't going to do the full micropile foundation stabilization. They could have taken that $100 million if their goal was strictly to pump up property values and paid a Kardashian to move in for a year. I think that would have done way more for their property values. And one lingering question from local engineers and others about this perimeter piling upgrade is, to what extent did it complicate or even compromise the performance of this building during a major seismic event, a magnitude 6.7 or greater earthquake? That remains a question in many people's mind because it's a very complicated and, in fact, heterogeneous foundation. You have part of the building that's on 900 some piles that extend to a depth of 80 feet. And then you've got two sides of the building where the piling extend all the way to bedrock. It's a very complicated soil structure interaction problem. But we can see here a model of the Millennium Tower supported by these 900 some pile that go to this dense sand layer. And then you have stresses that are transferred to this clay layer that cause it to consolidate with the associated settlement. The thing that bothers me the most about this whole building saga is that real important questions have never been answered publicly. And some of the key questions that occur to me is, how did the original geotechnical engineers apparently make such a fundamental mistake in their original calculation of building settlement? They calculated 6 inches of settlement they got well over 19 inches of settlement. Now, there were people who blamed nearby dewatering during construction. Dewatering is you pump water out of the ground to lower the groundwater level to facilitate various aspects of construction. That should have been anticipated, in my view. And apparently, that was not stipulated in terms of precaution in the original geotechnical report. I've read the original geotechnical reports and didn't see any mention about preventing dewatering at the Millennium Tower site or adjacent sites. I've done geotechnical engineering for foundation design where the owner slash developer was trying to avoid deep foundations. So we put the foundation on a very thick, heavily reinforced concrete mat. But I had to stipulate, look, you can never place fill above a certain height here. You can never dewater below a certain level. It was all clearly stipulated in the original design. Whether they followed that or not was up to them, but the rules of the road were established, and that doesn't appear to have happened here for some reason. And going back to question number one, how did they miscalculate the total foundation settlement? It's a mystery to me because the methodology for calculating settlement of a pile group like this is called the equivalent raft method, and it was developed in 1948 by Terzaghi and Peck, two of the leading proponents of geotechnical engineering. Many people call them the fathers of geotechnical engineering. So that concept, that methodology was around for about 60 years before the designers had essentially the same situation and somehow miscalculated the building settlement, apparently. Another question I have is exactly why did the San Francisco Building Department allow this building construction to proceed with such a heavy reinforced concrete building with pile foundations that did not extend to bedrock? The short answer is I don't know. You've got different people at the building department now than you did at the time. I know some of the local politicians have insinuated some level of corruption. I don't think anyone's ever been charged with anything along those lines, but you have to wonder. Because one of the things that was particularly interesting is exactly why did the San Francisco Building Department eliminate the requirement for an independent peer review of the foundation design for Millennium Tower when such a review by the now late MIT professor Chuck Ladd revealed the similarly designed building at 80 Natoma would have excessive foundation settlement, and as a result, the permit was pulled for construction by the San Francisco Building Department. And by the way, it was the same geotechnical engineering firm at the time who designed the foundation of both 80 Natoma and the Millennium Tower, this Treadwell and Rollo, who subsequently sold to another engineering firm called Langen. Again, we don't have the answer to that. Another question I have is why did engineers agree to design and implement a so-called fix for the foundation settlement and building tilt when they said that the sole reason for such a fix was to help the unit owners improve their resale value? Ron Hamburger went on an extensive promotional tour for his work associated with the what they called the perimeter pile upgrade, the voluntary upgrade. He gave this presentation at the KU Structural Engineering Conference on March 5th, 2020. This was about a year before they actually started doing the work to install these perimeter piling. And his key conclusions from this presentation was settlement has not impacted the building's seismic resistance. There is no reason structurally that the building needs to be upgraded. Homeowners need a major retrofit to revalue their units. So I think that's a pretty cynical reason. Perhaps it's economically reasonable, but we know later that the fix actually caused more problems initially than they were intended to solve. So again, the first order of business, in my view, should be to do no harm. And I just don't get it how this all came about. I mean, again, they blame the specialty foundation contractor. I've been involved with many designs where I had to stipulate certain aspects of the construction methodology or the means being used. Normally, you leave all those details up to the contractor. You don't want to dictate means and methods, but there are certain aspects that do have to be dictated. For example, for drilled shaft construction, a type of deep foundation where you excavate a hole and you place a reinforcing cage and then concrete from the bottom up to create a deep foundation element, on many projects, you don't allow the contractor to install the drilled shafts one right next to the other. You would alternate so that you don't undermine the installation of the first shaft, for example, while it's still curing by drilling a hole right next to it that could cause movement or instability with the first foundation element until it's cured out. So again, that's a very simple example of where a designer would stipulate some restrictions on the installation process. And for whatever reason, that doesn't appear to have been done here to the extent necessary to prevent a problem. Now, back in October of 2024, I attended a webinar that was presented by Ron Hamburger with Simpson, Gumpertz, and Hager, and it was stipulated that you couldn't record any of this webinar, which I honored. And he answered some questions at the very end of his presentation. And the question I posed to him was, what was his thoughts about local engineers, structural and geotechnical engineers with decades of experience, uh, making statements that were critical of this perimeter piling upgrade, that it was limited, it complicated in all likelihood the seismic performance of the building, that instead the micropile remediation that had a uniform distribution through the mat in between the existing piles and these micropile going to bedrock was a much better solution. And his response was he wished that these critics would have just came to him privately. And I thought, well, you're going on a promotional tour of what you did. You're very public about essentially what a great job everybody did in this repair effort. And to the extent that anybody has any criticism, they can only offer it privately to you, and you could decide how you're going to deal with it, if at all. So I just don't like the whole lack of transparency with this situation, in my view, in terms of informing the public about what really happened and why. It's not surprising in modern society and in engineering. Uh, Things are covered up in lawsuit agreements, non-disclosures as part of the settlement. People want to avoid liability. They don't want to admit fault. It's just, it's really unfortunate. Revealing problems like that to improve the profession, a given profession, used to be part of the purview of professional societies. The leading or the largest professional society for civil engineers, which includes geotechnical engineers and structural engineers, is the American Society of Civil Engineers. Goes back about 150 years. It's a very large organization. And I haven't been a member of that organization for the last 18 years. I think they lost their way. They were promoting having a master's degree before you can get engineering licensure, which I thought was just a money grab for the universities. But I digress. The ASCE published in 2023 a paper that they called a case history of all the geotechnical issues associated with the Millennium Tower. And that study was paid for, was commissioned by the developer of the Millennium Tower. So to me, it was a conflict of interest, although they acknowledged that history of the funding for their study. But if you read the study, and I've got a link to it in the description, they completely gloss over the main issues with what happened with the original design of this foundation. Why did anybody think that it could work without excessive settlement, having pile foundations not extend to bedrock? So this is my problem. You have a professional society that says they're presenting a case history. They gloss over certain facts because, quite frankly, the geotechnical design was commissioned by the building developer, the original design. And I think it would be maybe awkward if the people paying for your study, you point out that, hey, yeah, the people that you hired to do the original geotech missed the boat here. So that's my personal take on it. Is to me, it's just take it as a whole, read the paper, and it doesn't answer, in my mind, the key questions that people would normally have about how did we get here in the first place. With that, I want to do a quick book mention. The Go-Between by L.P. Hartley, a British author. I really enjoyed this book, as every book I mention I enjoy. I don't mention the clunkers. This is a fantastic, some people call it a coming of age story, but it's really written as a memoir. The main character is writing when he's in his 60s about the summer of 1900 when he was 12 and had an extended stay at a rich friend's estate and was there up to his 13th birthday. And he's trying to make sense of what he understood at the time as really a young boy becoming an adult and having flashes of adult insight. And he was used as a messenger to essentially help people communicate to conduct an illicit love affair. And he was slow to clue in on what happened. And that love affair had tragic consequences, as it turned out, that affected him for the rest of his life. But it's a very interesting story. I've been reading a lot of books lately by British authors, and they have some different insights. I mean, that's why you read different people. You read the Russian authors, British authors, American authors. Just lots of great classic literature out there. So if you want to check that out, there's a link in the description. With that, I want to send a shout out to those of you who've contributed to Buy Me a Coffee. That's one of the better ways to support this channel. I also want to thank the channel members and those of you who've contributed to Super Thanks. I'll continue to follow other interesting construction and geotechnical engineering issues as I've encountered them. As I've stated, I don't think you're going to hear anything more about Millennium Tower, and that's going to be by design. Again, unless there's a major earthquake, and then people will assess how well the building's performed during such an event. So stay tuned for future videos, everyone.